Mohammed, and welcome everybody to my session. I've been an incident responder for quite a while now. I've changed sites and I work in the Swiss Ministry of Foreign Affairs in a unit that deals with cyber risks, but not from a technical point of view, but from a diplomatic point of view. And one of the projects I run is the Geneva Dialogue that I'd like to talk a little bit about and tell its findings. But why does it even need that? So if you start working for the government feels we're responsible for everything. Obviously, we make the laws. We are the ones that control everything. And if you want to be the party spoiler, you tell, well, that's all fine and dandy, but you don't own the infrastructure. You don't run the infrastructure. You don't write the software. As a matter of fact, there's nothing you do whatsoever that would even give you the ability to do anything. The infrastructure is created, operated, and owned mostly by the private sector. So there's a big question about what is the roles and what are the responsibilities of the private sector, and what do non-state actors actually need to do this? And this is what the Geneva Dialogue is out to explore. It's to facilitate an inclusive global dialogue on the roles and responsibilities in cyberspace by non-state actors. So how does this dialogue work? How is it set up? I'll just give you a short rundown. Typically, if you in the governments, you differentiate between different stakeholder groups. There's obviously civil society, which traditionally has been the biggest part to talk to. It's also the one that's probably least listened to. There's the private sector and industry. That's probably what most of us are from here. There's academia, that's not to be underestimated, and there's the technical community, which again is where we feel we belong to. And and they all have a say, and they all have a really crucial role in making sure the internet is safe. It's when I got into this space like some 25 years ago, it was mostly about network security. But today we realize there's many more actors. There's, for example, CERTs. I had at the reception yesterday a conversation, and we were wondering how many people really know what a CERT does. Show of hands in here in the room, who thinks they know what a CERT actually does? So it's quite a few people, but there's also a number of people who don't know this. So if this community thinks we're not always really sure what these people are doing, think about the diplomats. They probably don't know at all what this is about. At the same time, the states have come up with what's called norms, and I'm going to show you the norms, that kind of say how we should behave in cyberspace. And so now we have to bring this together. We have to bring this kind of incomplete knowledge together with what states would like to have. Who is part of the Geneva Dialogue? I think this is a fairly broad dialogue. So we have a lot of private sector companies and organizations. You see in the middle a couple of logos that are grouped together. That's what we call the core group. These are organizations that are deeply involved in the process. And I think what's really important is not so much that there's many logos and a few are in the middle. What's really important is that this dialogue is open to everyone but states. So if you are interested in these type of dialogues, please approach me, and you can be part of this. It's not a big time investment. Typically, we have 4 consultative kind of online sessions per year where we ask questions, we go into virtual discussion groups and try to answer this. We also have a bunch of master classes where we get kind of people either from the technical community, but also from the political community to talk about things, to talk about the backgrounds. For example, we had the person that wrote the EU Cyber Resilience Act, explaining us what his thoughts were. So you get to learn a lot, and you get to comment on this. And this is all stuff that goes back into the dialogue. So how did it start? Well, it started 2018 by the Swiss government. 2018, this was right after the first set of norms have been published by the United Nations. There was a lot of discussion, but from my taste, no real tangible output. There was an output report, whatever that's supposed to mean. And then 2023, I took this over, and for me it was kind of important that we become a little more concrete so that we actually can discuss what it is we expect, but also what it is that technical folks need to do their job properly. Because sometimes governments come up with really strange requirements and laws that just don't make any sense from a technical point of view. I mean, they may be well-intended, but kind of it doesn't really match with reality. So in the first year, we focused on supply chain security and vulnerabilities, because that's something we've been working before, and it's also a really complicated topic. It's something that for states is very, very important. And I'm talking a little more about this. Then in the last 2 years, we've talked a lot about critical infrastructures, because again, this is something that becomes increasingly more important. Critical infrastructure protection has been a topic for the past 30 years. If you look at statistics that analyze nation-state operations, you see they increasingly start to target critical infrastructures, like even critical infrastructures such as water or power, health systems, and that's a big concern. So obviously, we need to do something about this. So who is responsible for protecting critical infrastructure? Is it states? Who thinks states are responsible for protecting critical infrastructures? I see very little support for that thesis. One or two hands. Well, of course, states have kind of a responsibility, but what can they do? I mean, in cyberspace, you cannot place tanks around a critical infrastructure. That somehow doesn't really work. And that's what we try to investigate. So to repeat what the basis is, I'd like to kind of represent this, what's called the UN Framework for Responsible State Behavior in Cyberspace. This is the outcome of over 20 years of negotiations at the United Nations. And I mean, you could argue that it took quite a long time to reach so little, but then given that this was actually accepted by every state, every single state that is a UN member agreed to that. And this thing has 4 pillars. The first one, and if you work for Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the most important one is that international law halts in cyberspace. So you cannot do stuff in cyberspace that you also cannot do in physical space. So some people may wonder, well, what's that supposed to mean? But if you look, today we heard that there was an attack that kind of had a physical damage here in the country. It was attributed to an activist group, not to a state. Had this been a state, it would have been in breach of international law. So that took about 5 or 6 years to negotiate until people could agree. And this is still an ongoing discussion. What does international law mean in cyberspace? The international law we have today was written after World War II. And if you read through these texts, you kind of feel this physical war. And so now we have to translate this into cyber. And that's not really easy. But at least we accept that this is the basis. The second thing is norms. Think of norms as non-binding laws or soft law. It's something you kind of just do, even though it's not the law, you should do this. I mean, if you go on a highway, technically in most countries, you can go as slow as you want to, but still it's not something you do. If you're in the UK, you queue for the bus. There's no law that says you have to queue for the bus, but you do it. That's what norms are. And I'm going to show you a couple of norms. The next thing is what's called confidence-building measures. That sounds even more obscure. But think of confidence-building measures as gentlemen agreements between states. It kind of are recommendations how states should work together to make the internet a better place. And then last, but not least, and in particularly very important for first, there's the last pillar, cyber capacity building. Most diplomats think of capacity building as kind of we deliver training courses or we buy expensive equipment. First, of course, has the core program, which you heard about, which really is about enabling and empowering organizations to protect cyberspace. I think it's actually quite an achievement that the UN, the General Assembly agrees that to make cyberspace, to make the internet a better place, we need to help countries to actually have the abilities and capabilities to defend themselves. At the conference here, we have something over 100 countries represented. That means we have nearly 180 countries that are not in the room. And there's a good question, what are these countries doing? Because the internet is going to be present in these countries. But what are these norms? So there are all the norms and CBMs, the confidence building measures, and I'm not going to read through all of them. I'm just going to look at a few of them. So there is the norms, and I can barely read this. For example, norm F that says, do not damage critical infrastructure. So all states agree that at least in peacetime, attacking critical infrastructure is a bad thing to do. Yet it happens. There's also an obligation for states to actually invest in protecting critical infrastructures. So that's where we are. That's where we kind of took out to discuss in the past 2 years with all the members of these organizations whose logos you saw, and to try to figure out what this is. And in particular, we tried to answer these questions. How do cyber norms guide actors in protecting critical infrastructure? So what does protect critical infrastructure, what does this translate into for you? It's you go back home, you start working in your companies, you kind of now know that the UN decided, hey, it should actually be important that you protect critical infrastructure. What does it mean? How are non-state actors expected? What are they expected to do? We don't really know this. The UN gives very, very little guidance. It's always kind of, and that's kind of typical, you could argue, that states say, oh, the private sector should do this, and then the technical community should do that, because it's all difficult problems. And what's the best problems? It's someone else's problems. So let's make these problems someone else's problems. So we translate this, we turned this around and said, how do non-state stakeholders actually understand the implementation? So let's tell states what this community thinks its roles and responsibilities are, and what they need to be able to do the job. And in particular, we focused on responsibility. So what is something we can expect reasonably, and a cheap giveaway is, for example, manufacturers or everybody really should be careful with vulnerabilities. They should be patched. We all know this is not happening, but we all feel, yes, it actually should be happening. But then there's a further question, are there incentives? What can states do to motivate stakeholders to do certain things? Clearly, one thing that states tend to like to do is come up with rules and laws. Do they work? That's a good question. Maybe they don't really always work. What are the challenges? It's again, states typically don't really know what the challenges are. Why is it so hard to patch vulnerabilities? I mean, it seems easy. You just turn on auto update until you tell people, well, in this medical device here, I'm legally not allowed to have auto update running. And how would you feel about the pilot announcing, welcome to flight such and such? In the next 5 minutes, the lights are going to flicker because we're going to install a security update while we take off. Probably not very good. And what are good practices? We also try to identify all the stakeholders that there are, because it's more than just big tech companies and maybe ISPs. We have the operators of critical infrastructure who have their own responsibility, who do stuff with the devices they buy that the producers have no idea about. It's when I talk to people in research, they often say, we don't even know all of our customers. Not to say what they actually do with the equipment. I mean, they use this stuff in ways that we never foresaw. A big issue really is open source. What are we going to do with open source? It's a lot of the open source community is very, very vocal and very kind of aggressively saying, you take our software, we don't really care about anything. But is this the right way to do? Can we expect something from an open source author of the open source community? What does the rest of the technical community have to do about open source? What's the obligations that, or the responsibilities that commercial companies that use open source products have towards the open source projects? These are all nifty questions that no one really knows the answers to. And we also talk to cybersecurity researchers because we all know that some of the research can go horribly wrong. I mean, take Heartbleed, for example, where we had kind of two competing research groups, and the thing went horribly foul and horribly bad. You see today, like we see this over and over again. There's irresponsible disclosure. There's a lot of discussions about bug bounty programs. Is it feasible that bug bounty programs cash in big bounties for vulnerabilities in open source software that people create without any financial benefit? Difficult question. And last but not least, civil society. Civil society is quite often are the victims, especially in the global south. Activists are frequently attacked. But do they have a responsibility? Where do they play in? I find the last one really the hardest one, and in my view, we haven't really come to a good conclusion. But this is what we are doing. Now, what are the key messages? So we discussed this for quite a while. So we worked about 2 years on this. If you Google Geneva Manual, you'll find the chapter. Feedback is welcome. But there's a couple of key messages. So we started with kind of looking at what do we feel is critical infrastructure, what are challenges, and we identified 7 challenges. One of the things that we concluded is that the thinking we have about critical infrastructure is still tied way too much into physical critical infrastructure. A lot of policymakers think critical infrastructures are kind of something you can build a fence around. But that's not true in cyberspace. The infrastructure, the core of the internet, is not a national thing. It's an international thing. Yes, it belongs to organizations that are national organizations, but it really is a global infrastructure. And it's not only kind of cables, and it's also the protocols like BGP, like DNS, that are crucial to function. So these should be part of the critical infrastructure. States should not start meddling with these technologies, and states should take measures to protect these. So, but for that, we need to have kind of better definitions. Another challenge that people identified was that there's a lot of secrecy. Most states kind of say what sectors are critical infrastructure, and they're kind of the no-brainers: health, finance, energy. Yes. But what is part of that pot? That's, for security reasons, always confidential, and that makes it really hard. If you have a norm, if states say you should not attack critical infrastructure, yet you don't really know what critical infrastructure is, you've got a problem. The answer, of course, always is, oh, but we don't want to give a list of targets. This is kind of a chicken and egg thing that I don't really know how to solve, but we feel there needs to be more discussions to actually identify what is critical infrastructure that people really should leave their fingers off. Now, a lot of people would argue, well, come on, I mean, it's obvious to everybody, states should just stop doing this stuff. Yes, I totally agree, but I also feel that's a little bit naive. That's just not gonna happen. If you call for everybody to be nice, hey, I'm all in, but sadly, I'm too pessimistic for that to happen. But maybe, just maybe, we can agree that certain things are off limits. I still find it mind-boggling that some states feel it's okay to attack a hospital because it's so obviously a critical infrastructure that's a civilian critical infrastructure. I don't know. Then another thing that I thought was interesting is that all the participants said, hey, we kind of all talk about security, but we don't really know what minimal standards are in a global setting. There's some countries that have kind of minimal standards, but they're not global. And so what is valid now? Should we So there was a call for kind of having global standards. And again, I think this is where this community can come in, that we actually say, hey, look, we feel that's what's important. The first standards committee is working on some of these initiatives. I think there's a lot of potentials, because I actually do think that global standards, industry standards, are way more powerful than standards that states do. So I think there's a role for first. Then vulnerabilities, that's kind of a no-brainer. Yes, this is hard. Just look at the discussion about CV we currently have. It's a big mess. So what we feel, but also felt in this community of experts, is that because the world becomes more polar, it's politicized, it's really hard to start talking to other people about security issues. It's now way harder to talk to Chinese companies or Russian organizations. I just talked to somebody from a national team who says, we still send stuff to Russian teams and these phishing pages seem to disappear, but we never get an answer. This is bad. I agree, we have some really bad actors and there's a lot of things going wrong. But somehow in the security community, we should be able to exchange information. What are the conditions that we can do this? What information should we exchange? These are all important and difficult questions. But right now, I think the system is moving the wrong way. And at the end of the day, we don't want to have a Chinese security community, a Western security community, and they don't exchange any information, because that's not how the internet works. We can do this if we split the internet, but that's not something we want to. Again, the Geneva Dialogue doesn't try to resolve all of these difficult questions. It tries to document them and say, hey, this is something where we need to think more, where we need to talk a little more. And then when the UN started discussing, UNGG means the United Nations group of government group of experts. They're the ones that created these norms. They were talking about intentional damage to stuff. What about damage that just happens as collateral damage? If you look at the big cyber operations in recent years, the problem wasn't that the targets had an issue. The problem was that things went way out of hand. Look at NotPetya that took down. NotPetya was intended to kind of intimidate the Ukrainians. It took down Maersk. That was not an intended goal. Look at the attack against Albania. I don't think the idea ever was to kind of completely erase the infrastructure there. We have to think a little bit about these type of things. So let me just spend 2 more minutes on 2 of the key messages that I feel are really important. It's this cross-border infrastructure stuff. I really feel that our community still needs to become a lot better in analyzing threats pertaining to cross-border infrastructure. There has been recently a big discussion about subsea cables. People start realizing subsea cables are cross-border. They go through international waters. So the discussion is starting there, but we're not discussing the protocols, all the software components of these things. For me, I think that is a challenge. And then the other thing that comes out of key message number 7, the increasing conflicts. We also need to talk about the roles of all our members here in the room during conflicts. Now, all these norms are peacetime norms, but we see an increasing number of conflicts. And there's a lot of questions about if you work with a country that's in a conflict, or you support a third country that's in a conflict, what does that mean for us? These are questions that no one really can answer. These are questions that a lot of, for example, the ICRC is asking. But it would be good if we as a community also start thinking about these questions. And this is not about saying, oh, the tech companies should never participate in this. That's not what this is about. It's about trying to think, what are the implications, what are the risks, and how can we mitigate risks that have a wider effect. Look at the Geneva Dialogue. if you are interested, you can participate. It's not a big time commitment. There's often the group is quite small, maybe 10, 15 people, but you are heard. The manual is online. If you want to make a contribution, if you have a comment on that, feel free to reach out. We value input and we will take this input into account. Our goal really is to make every voice heard. It's not to tell people what the right and wrong thing is, but we want to tell states what they have to think about if they're really serious about global cybersecurity. I think with that, I close. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Then please step up the mics.
Hello. Yeah. Bonjour, Serge. So we have two Swiss here in the room. You are here talking about United Nations dialogue, and I am the new elected Study Group 17 chair at the International Telecommunication Union, so the standard body that is doing X.509. So you are right. There is a problem for member states to understand critical infrastructure. It was even carved out from ITU resolutions. So we do not have formally the right to work on standards, global standards for critical infrastructures, because this is considered sovereign rights from the member states. However, there are plenty of global standards that are applicable regardless of critical infrastructure, and they are good and they are actually progressing. The new opportunity will of course be with AI, because AI is becoming a risk and an opportunity. But I don't see too much in your presentation. Have you discussed that in the dialogue within governments on United Nations regarding critical infrastructure? Because I think this is going to be a new challenge.
So, thanks for that question. There's two things I want to talk about. I think, yes, I know there is a lot of literature and a lot of standards pertaining to critical infrastructure, but participants say, for example, from companies that create medical equipment, that there's conflicting legal requirements. So what's forbidden in one country is actually compulsory in another one, and that makes these things really very, very difficult. So some people call this harmonization of regulation, and this is one of the big issues. And some countries, like for example China, is calling for a list of designated critical infra. So it's maybe supercritical infrastructure. I'm not sure this is the solution, but it seems that companies feel uneasy about that. The second question about AI, yes, we started discussing AI. All the norms discussion that were led didn't have AI in mind, because AI has only become en vogue since ChatGPT got live, 2 years ago. We are discussing this. It's mostly the use of AI, but it is something that we try to contemplate on discussing with stakeholders. What are the risks stemming from AI? And my personal opinion is this is just right now way too many buzzwords and too few concrete topics we can talk about. But it's certainly something that's going to come on the agenda.
Thanks. Thanks, Serge. I also have a question. So I work for an NGO on capacity building projects, cybersecurity capacity building, in a conflicted or post-conflict region. And I have a question. Do you see a potential for applying some of the CBMs in a practical way to some of these post-conflict or post-conflict regions and making them work? I mean, why I'm asking, in our experience, is we, for example, engage with the private sector, and through engagements with the private sector, we manage to overcome political obstacles for cooperation, information sharing in some of the sectors. So could there be a link between this, the global process and the local process, and how? Thanks.
I find it's a very challenging question because it's quite deep. But yes, I do think regional initiatives play a very important role. And when we talk about, so we are a global organization, we have people from over 100 countries here, but obviously there needs to be a regional spin to a lot of the things. I mean, what makes sense in Europe doesn't necessarily need to make sense in Asia. And I think this is a challenge we all know. I mean, we've all been in meetings where we kind of felt, hey, there's a mismatch in cultures. If you look at first missions, there's this the global language that we want that goes in towards that. But I totally agree that collaboration with the private sector, with non-state actors, quite often can do things that are way more difficult for states to do. And what I usually recommend and what I do quite often in my day job is tabletop exercises where we get people in a room to start discussing things and without actually naming and shaming anyone. And I find this helps a lot. I think time is over. I'm going to be around. If you're interested, please get in touch. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Serge.